You guys got it on tape. I did not nudge him in any way. That was, so first I'd like to thank you guys for showing up. I was talking to my wife on the phone last night and, looking over the schedule, and I said, geez, I wouldn't go to hear our talk. I'd go to hear Pat Michaels again at this time. So I am grateful that so many of you showed up today. And let me pull up my PowerPoint, and hopefully it won't corrupt me absolutely. Let's see. Okay. Oops. I probably got to get out of right. Okay, there we go. Okay, so my name's Robert Murphy. I work for the Institute for Energy Research. I was hired by Rob Bradley. This is his organization that he's founded, and the main project he's assigned me to do is, as you've just heard, the mainstream case. The economists, when they take what the natural scientists are saying at face value, and they say, okay, we're economists, we're social scientists, we're not qualified to say whether these claims are true, but if they are true, we'll take what the alleged consensus is telling us, then that means government needs to do something, and there's two proposals. There's the cap and trade, and then there's a carbon tax. And so Ken Green has talked about the problems with cap and trade, and many mainstream economists agree with much of what he's said, and there's some other reasons, too, that they would give for why a cap and trade is not a good idea. And so the default is a carbon tax, that given that there's this problem, the governments have to do something. A lot of mainstream economists, and even many free market economists, and just a good example here, favor a carbon tax. So what I'm going to talk to you today is a little bit of my research on why I'm trying to say that I agree with the problems of cap and trade, but also the case for a carbon tax is more dubious than some might realize. And incidentally, let me just note that I think just the fact that he and I had this slight disagreement here, and we're showing you different sides, shows that this conference is not what some of its critics have made it out to be, that we're not all just one opinion here. We do have a difference, and this really is an exchange of ideas, and we don't all have the same ideas. So I realize some people here aren't trained economists, and so let me just very quickly go over to make sure you understand where are these mainstream economists coming from when they advocate a carbon tax. Well, the standard economics says that decentralized markets, they only yield efficient outcomes when individuals bear the full cost of their actions, right? So if businesses were able to hire workers and not pay them wages, that would lead to inefficiencies because business would use more labor than they ought to. Or if businesses could use steel in making cars and whatever without having to pay the market price for steel, then that would lead to problems, right? So businesses need to realize the opportunity cost of their actions in order for the outcome, in order for the invisible hand to operate properly. Now, in the free market, the situation right now is that firms and individuals don't suffer any penalty from carbon emissions, right? And so if it really is the case that what the natural scientists, or many of them, are telling us is true, that these emissions are going to harm whether it's our children or several generations down the line, but if they really are going to have these catastrophic consequences, then the current emitters are not taking that into account when they decide how much to emit, and therefore we have what's called market failure. And Sir Nicholas Stern is the author of the Stern Report, Review on Climate Change, and he has come out very strongly for high aggressive carbon taxes to deal with this market failure. So again, just in terms of standard economics, if there is what's called a negative externality, what is the solution? You grab any mainstream textbook and it will say that the government can come in and help address this imbalance by imposing a tax on the externality. So if it's just classic pollution, back 40 years ago, the textbooks would have said, well, if a firm has a smokestack and is pumping stuff into the air that causes lung cancer, then the government needs to tax that pollution to give firms the incentive to cut back and to install scrubbers or what have you. That's the way the government deals with this problem. Okay, now the issue when you want to say, okay, well, I'm doing research on attacking or critiquing the case for a carbon tax, you could sort of go against this abstract boogeyman, or the approach I've taken in talking with Rob Bradley about this is we picked William Nordhaus, and he's the author of what's called the DICE model, and I'll explain that in a bit, but let me just explain to you why we settled on him, because it would have been easy if we had picked, let's say, the Stern Report, the Stern Review, that came out very aggressively for taxing carbon, But a lot of mainstream economists pointed out holes in their analysis, and it would have been too easy. Whereas Nordhaus, we'll see in a few moments, that his case is fairly reasonable, that if you're going to be a mainstream economist and use standard tools, and you're going to stipulate, for the sake of argument, the natural scientists' claims about carbon emissions and the effect on climate change and the impacts to human beings, if you're going to stipulate all that, then Nordhaus's case is pretty straightforward. So that's why I'm picking we're picking him as sort of a representative. And again, just to explain his credentials, he's been a professor at Yale since '67. He's at one point was a co-author with Paul Samuelson on what was at the time the best-selling economics textbook ever. And the friendly guy is true that he answers my emails. He's very terse with me, but he does respond to emails, and so that was a point in his favor, that this would be a good candidate, because at least I can check with him to make sure I'm not misrepresenting his views. And then his DICE model, which I'll talk about now. So the point is here that he has been working on this for decades. So it's not merely that Nordhaus is an acknowledged big gun economist, but he's also a pioneer in climate change itself. And his DICE model is I've talked with people from Resources for the Future just to make sure that I'm not wasting time attacking somebody that mainstream economists who are into climate change would think, oh, that you're shooting fish in a barrel, don't attack a straw man. So we've checked around, and this seems to be a fair case, a fair opponent, if you will. So what does Nordhaus's DICE model tell us? Well, it stands for the Dynamic Integrated Model of Climate and the Economy. That's where the acronym comes from. And it starts out, for those of you who have had some training in economics, it's a standard growth, a neoclassical growth model, where there's one good, and the way the economy grows is you can either consume all the output today, or you can refrain from present consumption and invest some of it to grow the capital stock. And so every period, the capital stock shrinks because of depreciation, that you're just using up the machinery and what have you. And so you have to do a minimum amount of investment to keep it that way. And if you want to get more productive over time, you have to not consume the entire output every period, but you have to plow some of it back to have net investment. So that's the standard trade-off, that you're trading off consumption today for a greater amount of consumption in the future. Now, where things differ from standard models is that he also allows for investment in what he calls climate capital. And so the way the model works is, if you restrict emissions now by imposing controls on the production function, then you're definitely restricting present consumption, right? Because other things equal, without having any constraints, that's going to give you the most output, that businesses are going to produce as much as they can. And so if you put on business an additional constraint and say that you can no longer emit carbon, then obviously output goes down. All right, so you're trading off present consumption in exchange for having reduced climate damages in the future. Okay, and then a calibrated carbon tax is what leads businesses to make the socially correct amount of investment in climate capital. Okay, now Nordhaus is what I'm calling a true economist, because a lot of the mistakes that the environmentalists make in terms of, as an economist reading their literature, and they start throwing claims around, and you realize as an economist, well, no, that's not a correct statement, that your science might be right, but you're translating it incorrectly into terms of policy conclusions. And Nordhaus doesn't make that gross of an error. That, again, he's a very well-trained economist in terms of mainstream economics. So, for example, the way the Stern Review gets such incredibly high recommended carbon taxes is when they discount future damages from climate change, they use a very low discount rate, because they say, look, ethically, there's no reason we should put our needs above those of people 1,000 years from now. And so if it really is true that what we're doing today is going to have impacts far into the future, we need to treat them on the same footing as how we treat ourselves. And that's not what Nordhaus does. He uses the market-based rate of interest, or return to capital, to discount future costs and benefits, which makes sense. I can't get into right now because of time, but that's the economically sensible thing to do. If you're going to try to put everything in terms of present dollars and cents, you need to use the market rate of interest, otherwise you're going to come up with bogus results. And he also uses a cost-benefit test to marginally slow warming. Okay, so what he's doing here is he's saying with Nordhaus's recommended optimal strategy, the damages from climate change are still going to be $17 trillion. So Nordhaus isn't saying, let's put on the full brakes, we have to save the climate at all costs. No, he's saying what his optimal recommendation is, in his own model, would still yield $17 trillion in damages from a warmer world. But he said, it would be silly for us to advise a more aggressive response, a steeper penalty on carbon emissions, because on the margin, the gains we would get from reduced global warming would not match the current loss in output on the margin, those additional reductions. Okay, so that's exactly the way you would want to think about it if you were being an economist. Okay, so just for your own information, this is what his optimal carbon tax profile is. It ramps up over time, and you can see, and these are dollars per ton of carbon, not of CO2. So these are actually, as far as some of the proposals running around, this isn't that bad. Okay, so again, these numbers are fairly reasonable if you stipulate the basic framework where Nordhaus is coming from. Okay, now I got to move quickly through this, but what are the problems with this model? Well, first of all, it overrates the harm. That Nordhaus's 1999 version said that 2.5 degrees of warming would currently cause over $50 billion just in U.S. damages, that when you add up the costs and benefits, because different regions, different sectors are affected differently, that he said it would have been about $50 billion in net damage. But if you turn to Mendelsohn and et al., if their collection, they say that, and these were one of the groups that Nordhaus relied on when he was collating his information to come up with, when he's making his model, he has to plug in numbers to say, well, with certain amounts of warming, how much damage is going to occur. And these guys say that it's 2.5 degrees Celsius warming would actually on net benefit the United States. Now, at this point, let me just very quickly explain to you how do we evaluate these claims. I was a little bit intimidated because I said, my background is not certainly in studying sectoral impacts of global warming on various parts of the economy. So how am I supposed to be a referee on this? That Nordhaus is saying, look, we've got Mendelsohn on the one side of the spectrum saying this amount of warming is net beneficial. We've got these other studies coming out also by economists who are working in climate change saying there's going to be these huge costs, net costs. So how was I supposed to evaluate? Well, I started looking into it. And the reason I like Mendelsohn is, let me just give you two quick examples of why I'm comfortable that the way he's approaching the problem and having his contributors in this collection, the framework they were given to work with, that I'm more comfortable with his numbers. Because they would do things like when they're trying to assess what's going to be the impacts of the United States agricultural sector if there's 2.5 degrees warming, they would allow the farmers to change which crops they planted. Okay, whereas the other models of the time, at least, I don't know if this is still true, but the ones they were responding to, when they would try to say, well, oh man, this amount of warming would be devastating to the agricultural sector, they were in their assumptions forcing farmers to continue to plant the same crop even as the temperatures went up, instead of rotating out and putting in crops that do better when it's warmer. All right, so that's an adaptation that would be fairly obvious and you would allow to go through. Another quick example, again, just to understand why I trust Mendelsohn's estimates more than some of the other more alarmist ones, is when it comes to recreation. They study the recreational sector. And they said, if the people who come up with these horrendous numbers, these forecasts of huge losses, they would look at downhill skiing and say, well, if it got warmer, those sectors that industry would get crushed. And then Mendelsohn would do things like look at summer sports and boating and things like that, and say, well, yeah, but if we look at those might also on net be benefited by a warmer climate. Okay, so these are fairly straightforward things to include in the model. It's not that you have to be an expert in this to try to evaluate. Okay, I got to go very quickly. DICE relies on near universal compliance with the carbon program. Okay, so that if the DICE model assumes basically the world all goes along with it, and whereas if China or India don't participate, then all bets are off as far as the numbers that Nordhaus is coming up with. A third problem is that DICE itself shows a bad policy can be worse. So I'll just, in the interest of time, just bring your attention, and sorry that the formatting on the different computers is a little bit jumbled, but the Gore proposal would be net costs of $21 trillion. So DICE, these aren't my estimates. I'm quoting this from Nordhaus's own paper, that the Gore proposal would cost us $21 trillion, whereas the optimal DICE thing would only give us net benefits of $3 trillion. So DICE's own numbers are showing if we do it wrong, it's going to be far worse than if we happen to do it perfectly correctly. And then the last point is it focuses on market failure but not government failure. That even all of these net costs and everything that I've shown there, that assumes it was all perfectly implemented. So yes, it's a bad policy. Gore's policy would be bad, but that number of the net 21 trillion loss assumed it was implemented properly, even though it was a bad goal. And we know just studying politicians and the real political process that wouldn't happen. And so in conclusion, I would say that there's this knowledge problem and that we need to just allow free markets to solve the problem, not rely on a carbon tax. Thank you.